Hello, welcome back. Today's lecture is going to be a continuation of yesterday's lecture, which was about Eisenhower and his domestic policy. Today will be Eisenhower and his foreign policy. And so we're going to have some pretty big events that are going to have some impact, not just during the Cold War, but also to modern America that are going to happen during the Eisenhower administration. One of the first things that you have to realize is, like we were talking about in the lecture on his Eisenhower's domestic policy, he's a budget hawk, which means he's very concerned about spending. He believes that spending has gotten out of control in America, and we're essentially, racking up all this debt that's really going to put our, future generations, our kids, in an unmanageable spot. And so he believes in containment. As a matter of fact, the Eisenhower doctrine is going to be very similar to the Truman doctrine. Um, and so he believes in domino theory and containment, but he wants to make sure that he tries to rein in the spending. He's very concerned that the military is growing too powerful, which is interesting because he's a military man, right? I mean, he was the supreme Allied commander, and he recognizes that the military is getting powerful. And just like most conservatives believe, that as the government expands, social services, the federal government gets stronger and stronger, and that impedes on our liberty, our freedoms. He also recognizes that, and this is the thing that a lot of conservatives don't recognize, is that growth in the military does the same thing. The more and more we rely on our military, the more powerful it becomes, and the more dangerous that becomes for our freedoms. And so he really wants to rein that in. As a matter of fact, he warns about the growth of the military-industrial complex, and so he's going to try and his foreign policy is all going to be about, yes, we got to be strong. We are fighting the Cold War, but we need to do it in not just a financially manageable way, but we also need to do it recognizing that if we continue to just let our military grow unchecked, that can be a dangerous thing. And so that's what he's saying when he warns about the growth of the military industrial complex. And it's just not about the military; it's about the arms manufacturers. It's about all of that. As they gain more and more power, more and more money, it puts liberty in danger. And so, to try and be strong and to limit the growth of communism, but also to rein in the size and the expense of the military, he essentially decides we'll spend less on our traditional military and more on nuclear weapons, and use nuclear weapons as a deterrent, and then essentially just tell the Soviet Union, look, if you mess around, our response is going to be massive retaliation. And so, you go all the way back to Teddy Roosevelt, speak softly and carry a big stick. I mean, Eisenhower's like, this is a gigantic stick, right? That's his massive retaliation policy that, and again, this goes back to George Kennan and, Article X and the containment policy. Kennan says the Soviets respond to strength and will try and take advantage of weakness. And so Eisenhower recognizes that, and he says, look, we're going to spend less on our domestic military, our traditional military. Soviet Union don't view that as a weakness, right? Because what we're going to do is we're going to spend more on nukes, and if you mess around, we'll use them. And so he threatens to use those nuclear weapons. Now, the plus side of that is we spend less money on the military. The negative side is if we're spending more money on nukes, guess what the Soviet Union's doing? Absolutely, spending more on nukes as well, which means this is going to escalate the arms race. That's essentially going to go on until the Cuban Missile Crisis, where people start to get really afraid that we might actually use these nukes. And then on the other side of that, you can't just have the best weapons. You also need the best intelligence. Eisenhower knows that firsthand because World War II, getting good intelligence wasn't as easy as he wanted it to be, and so he's going to establish the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, which is a foreign information gathering agency. So the CIA is not supposed to operate within the confines of the United States, but they'll essentially be spying on enemies around the world. And so if you have a CIA, you get better information, and so you can formulate policy better. But the CIA also is going to be used to kind of covertly help our friends and hurt our enemies. And so, they'll be responsible for help supporting people that are fighting communists. Some of the people we're supporting are really shady dictators, particularly in Central and South America, which is a large part of the reason why they tend to have some animosity towards us today. We'll justify that by saying, well, these guys are better than the communists. Are they? Some cases, yes, some cases, no. But so we'll rely on kind of these covert, not just like huge bombs, right? That's not the only thing he wants to, rely on. He also wants to rely on, spying and sabotage and, these kind of covert operations as well, which are less expensive than, these gigantic standing armies. So, what's the Eisenhower Doctrine? Well, it's going to revolve around essentially two different things. He wants, again, very similar to Truman, the power to use the armed forces to resist communists, and funds for military and economic assistance in the Middle East. Very similar to the Truman Doctrine that we had talked about in previous lectures, but he's also going to recognize the focus of the Middle East. The Middle East is going to start to play a very important role in American foreign policy. And interestingly enough, like everybody says it's for oil. Well, yeah, that is true. But there's been a very small amount of time in American history that the United States has been dependent on oil from the Middle East. The Carter administration, and for a very brief time period. In reality, American oil production, because of Texas, Oklahoma, and Alaska, we have for most of our history been oil independent. As a matter of fact, right now we are not only oil independent, we're one of the largest oil exporters in the world. And so, Middle East oil, this idea, oh, we're always going to war for oil in the Middle East. We just want to steal it and make some money. Yeah, companies make money off of that. American companies do make money off of oil from the Middle East, but not nearly what you would imagine it to be. In reality, Middle East oil is important to us for Europe. Europe does not have enough oil for itself. And so if Europe is going to continue to have a strong economy and a strong military, it needs oil for that. There are very few oil producing countries in Europe. There are some northern European countries that do have enough oil and are in fact oil exporters. But the big ones, Great Britain, France, Germany, they need this oil. At this point, it's Western Germany. They need this oil. And if we want them to stay capitalist democracies, their economies have to be, producing. They have to be making money, and they need this oil. And so we don't have enough to supply ourselves and all of their needs. And so we have to secure Middle East oil, not necessarily for us, but for Europe and the European economy. And remember, if the European economy tanks, they're going to be much more susceptible towards communism and even fascism, nationalist socialism, which is fascism. So we have to secure that Middle East oil, which means, in places like Iran, we're going to be supporting a dictator, the Shah, who's a real crappy dude. There'll be consequences for that later, and countries like Egypt, we're going to see are going to become hotspots during the Eisenhower administration. So the first crisis that we need to talk about is going to be the Suez Crisis. Excuse me while I have a drink of coffee. So, the Suez Crisis. Egypt is, a country we say they're in the Middle East. It's a North African country. Their population is mostly Arab, mostly Muslim, and so we group them into the Middle East. Um, but either way, the Egyptian government is being led by Gamal Nasser. Nasser is vying to be the kind of the Arab nationalist leader in the Middle East. Egypt's got one of the better economies in the Middle East. It's one of the most military powerful countries in the Middle East, and so the Egypt is a major player. And so Nasser recognizes that he has one of the most important geographic areas on the planet under his control, and that is the Suez Canal. Now, the Suez Canal was developed by European powers, essentially, and it's connecting the Mediterranean, and so it allows for you to essentially trade from. You can see it in the pictures above. The European powers can essentially go from the Mediterranean Ocean and be able to trade, cut through the Suez Canal and easily access Asian markets and Asian resources. And so the Suez Canal is one of the most economically important spots on the entire planet. Even today, billions and billions and billions of dollars of trade go through there. It's a shortcut that saves a ton of money and is super important. And so Nasser knows he controls that area. It's within his country, but at the time, the it's actually the canal is actually under the control of the European powers and Great Britain, and so the canal is kind of Egypt's trump card. Well, Nasser, who's really trying to expand the Egyptian economy, is looking for loans to build the Aswan Dam. And so we've got two kind of seemingly disconnected things here. We have the Suez Canal, which is super important economically for the entire world, and we've got Nasser's Aswan Dam project. And so America has promised loan money to Egypt to build the Aswan Dam. And, Eisenhower, starts to back out of those loans because, again, remember, Eisenhower is, very budget conscious and doesn't want to, spend all of that money. And so, at Nasser is going to start to take some aid from the Soviet Union to be able to build these dams. And so he's connecting creating a closer relationships with the Soviet Union. America doesn't like that. There's some saber rattling there. And Nasser, because he's starting to feel like he's got some backing from the Soviet Union, is going to take the next step. And the next step is he actually seizes the Suez Canal, because the American funds have dried up. And he's going to say, you know what? The Soviets are providing us some aid. It's not enough for this dam project. What we'll do is we'll seize the canal and we can start to charge people to go through the Suez. And so, the dam project's super important for Egypt, right? They've got some very fertile land in the Nile region, but then you expand into their country and it's not as fertile. And so if they want to grow their economy, they want to create this dam system that will make more land fertile. So it's very important to them. And, they have this resource that they can make money off of, charge people to go through the Suez. And that seems like a good solution for them. And so they're going to take over the canal, they're going to nationalize it, and they're going to say, hey, this is Egyptian property and we're going to we're going to control it and we're going to charge people to go through it. Well, Great Britain and France freak out. They're like, our economies can't take that. That's going to cost us tons of money. You could they're afraid that you could potentially shut off trade to people in countries you don't like, which is something that Nasser actually does. The creation Israel has been created post World War II as like a safe haven for Jews. The problem is that it was created in the Middle East, surrounded by enemies. They're going to kick Arabs off of their out of their traditional homeland. That's a very controversial statement. Who was there first, the Jews or the Arabs? Well, they've both been displaced a bunch of times, but there's no doubt about it. There were Arabs living there, and the Jews, when they took over, kicked a bunch of them out. Not all of them, but a bunch of them out. And so, the Arab population hates Israel. Nasser's trying to be like the Arab nationalist leader, so he wants their support. And so he essentially says, you know what, this new state of Israel is weak. It's in its infancy, and it is dependent upon trade through the Suez. And so he essentially says any ships trading with Israel can't go through the Suez, which means that they're going to have to essentially travel all the way around Africa to get to Israel, which is wildly expensive. That will kill Israel. So Israel can't have that. And so all of a sudden now you start to see a group of countries that are really threatened by the seizure of the Suez. And so, Great Britain, France, and Israel get together and they're like, this can't happen. We can't allow this to happen because it threatens our way of life, particularly Israel. There's no doubt about it. Israel probably would not survive without being able to use the Suez Canal. And so they come up with this plan that they think is really sneaky. It's not. Everybody's going to see through it. And they make a gigantic mistake because they don't include America in the plans. They do this behind Eisenhower's back, just kind of assuming that they can do it on their own, and that if they can't for some reason, America will back them up. That's a mistake. Great Britain and France, they used to be the number one powers in the world. They're still kind of convinced that they are. They don't really see the writing on the wall that America is now in charge of foreign policy for the West. And so they kind of feel like they can act independently. And so what they do is they convince Israel to attack the Suez and to take it over. And so they think if Israel attacks it, well, that's just for national survival. And so the Israelis, and the plan is the Israelis and the Egyptians will be fighting over the dam, right? The Egyptians will defend it. And then Great Britain and France will very quickly react, not to take over the Suez Canal, but to stop the fighting in that region, right? The world can't have the Suez Canal shut down for everybody. And so, the British and the French think that they can convince the world that they didn't jump in to take over the canal. They just jumped in to stop the fight so the canal can be opened back up for international trade. Then they're going to say, look, we need to control this canal because the Egyptians can't do it on their own. So that's their plan. Well, it all falls apart. Israel, they think Israel is gonna, there's gonna be this big battle over the Suez, but what they don't realize is since the creation of Israel, because they're surrounded by enemies, has built up a phenomenal military. With a wonderful command structure, which essentially allows commanders to kind of, they have mission goals, but then they're allowed the freedom to kind of like achieve those goals however they want. And so it's this very fluid, very fast military. And so when Israel attacks the canal, they actually take it over. And so the fighting is over. Israel controls the canal by the time the British and the French get there and say, oh, we're going to stop fighting. So it's really clear that all of this was set up. And so when that happens, all of a sudden things get out of control really quickly. Right. The Soviet Union, who has just agreed to closer relationships with Egypt, can't allow that to happen. It would be, it would just be too much of a PR nightmare for the Soviet Union. So they've got to back up Egypt. And so the new leader in the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, essentially says, get out of there, Europe. And if you don't, we'll use nukes. And so, at this point, Great Britain and France and Israel don't have nukes. They'll get them eventually, but they don't have them yet. And so all of a sudden now, what are they to do? They don't want to give up the canal and lose the canal for the West. But they certainly neither one, no, all three of those countries are not in a position to fight the Soviet Union, right? And particularly when the Soviet Union is threatening nukes. So what can they possibly do? You probably guessed it, right? Call the United States. And so that's what happens. They ring up the phone and they go, "Oh my God, Eisenhower, like, we need your help. They're threatening nukes." And Eisenhower says, you created this mess, right? And so you get yourselves out of it. If you think I'm going to risk going to war over this, you're wrong. And so at the end of the day, Great Britain has to back down. That's not just important because Great Britain has to give up control of the canal. I mean, it is important for that, but it sends an international signal to the entire world about who's in charge of foreign policy for the West, right? I mean, Great Britain thought they could act on their own, and they tried it, and they had to back down. And they had to back down because they couldn't get the help of the United States. When they got in a jam, who did they turn to? The United States. And it was Eisenhower that essentially had to say, you know what? You dug this hole, you get yourself out of it. And so uh, Great Britain's going to have to pull out of the canal. But that doesn't mean that Egypt keeps control of the canal, at least for now, because the world does recognize, like, holy cow, we can't have these things happening at the Suez. This is too important to the world. We need to ensure that everybody can use the canal, and it can't be used as a tool to strangle Israel or to, just decimate the European economy. And so the UN will step in and essentially control the canal. Now, there'll be issues there. We'll talk later. Israel and Egypt are going to fight a few more wars here. And so the control of the canal will change. But for now, the UN is going to take over control of the Suez Canal. And they're going to ensure that the international community is going to be able to use the canal. So it's going to essentially be open for everybody. The next major foreign policy issue during the Eisenhower administration is the beginning of the space race. And America believes in its dominance, and America is dominant. America's military is better than the Soviet Union's military. Now, they didn't really know that back then, but it was. Our economy was better than theirs. That's becoming more and more apparent when you look at, Germany and the communist side versus the capitalist side. And, we're pretty aware that our economy is better. But we also believe our university system is better and our education system is better. And it actually is. But our faith in that is going to be shaken during the space race. And that's in large part because the Soviet Union, even though their education system is not as good as ours, because the government is in control, it can kind of pick and choose areas where it just floods resources in. And, in those areas, the Soviet Union can be dominant, right? And so, they pick a couple of areas. They pick the space race for a PR campaign because the world is watching the space race. And so, everybody assumes whoever's leading the space race has the best scientists, has the best education system, even though that's not necessarily true. And they're going to pick nuclear weapons. And so those two areas, the Soviets are very competitive and sometimes lead the United States. And so the space race, it becomes really apparent that maybe the American system isn't ahead in all areas, and we're not ahead when it comes to the space race. It's in '57 that the Russians launched the first satellite into space. This totally freaks out Americans. The first satellite is Sputnik. Americans don't know what to make of Sputnik. We don't know what it does, and so the average American knows its orbit. It takes about 98 minutes to orbit the Earth, and so people kind of know when it's going to be overhead, and they think, like, is it spying on us? Can it attack us? In reality, all it can really do is, like, make a noise, like beep bop boop bop. signals off of the Earth. So it can't really do much, but they got there first, and that freaks us out because we kind of expect to be the winners when it comes to the space race. And so all of a sudden now the U.S. Department of Defense is in a rush. We're trailing when it comes to the space race, and so eventually we'll launch our first satellite, which is Explorer, and we're off to the races here trying to catch up. It won't be until Kennedy takes office that we actually start to lead when it comes to the space race. So that's a picture of Sputnik. Nothing super fancy. It's in orbit for a while. It can't really do a whole lot, but it is kind of a scary thing. So then the Soviets just they beat us again in the space race. They're going to be able to launch the first man in space in 1961. That's Yuri Gagarin. That's this guy right here. And so, this is at this point, Americans are freaking out. The Soviets here, and I've got a list. I'm going to read it to you. We're about a year behind the Soviets in the space race, and so we're freaked out. And so the Soviets send the first man to space. They send the Yuri Gagarin. They send the first woman to space. They take the first spacewalk, which means they actually leave the spaceship and have an astronaut actually out in space, or from the Soviets, a cosmonaut, not an astronaut. They're the first to smash a spacecraft into the moon. So not a soft landing, they just crash it into the moon. They're the first to impact Venus. So they do the same thing. They crash a spaceship into Venus, and they're the first to successfully have a soft landing on the moon. So they land a ship on the moon without crashing it. It's not manned, but they're able to land it there. And so all of these things freak out the Americans, and the American response really starts to become, oh my God, we have to double down on education, and particularly science and technology. And so you're going to see all across America, there's this huge push into science and technology to try and catch up. And so, kids start building model rockets, and, schools all across the country are really going to start to push kids away from a lot of the humanities, English, history, and really push math and science so we can eventually catch up. And eventually, we will catch up, and it's going to be Kennedy who just doubles down on the space race and just a ton of money into landing a man on the moon. All right, so space race is going on. We're losing that. And then during the Eisenhower administration, we're also going to see the rise of Fidel Castro in Cuba. And so, this is the next big challenge. Castro has been leading a revolution in Cuba for a very long time. The problem in Cuba is Cuba's kind of been a playground for the rich and famous in America for a very long time. There was a ton of money to be made in Cuba originally, right? So after the Spanish-American War, we set up a protectorate there. And, the American sugar industry just is making boatloads of money. They're using Cuban labor. And so American companies are making a ton of profit. They're paying the Cuban workers very little. And then, we start to, because the island is absolutely beautiful, American hotels and casinos are set up all across Cuba. And so, all of that is upsetting to a lot of the Cuban people. They're seeing all this wealth being created, and it's foreign companies and American companies that are making a lot of this money. The casinos and the hotels are a lot of them are being run by the American mafia, and so there's shady stuff going on. And so the leader, a guy by the name of Batista, is seen as an American puppet. And so Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, who are both kind of like Latin American revolutionaries, are hiding out in the hills of Cuba, fighting this revolution. It's very brutal. I mean, you see a lot of, you know, Che Guevara in particular gets romanticized, particularly among like academic leftists. I mean, you go to a college campus and you'll see kids wearing Che Guevara T-shirts, because he presents himself as this man of the people, throwing off the oppressor, and like presents this image of the very romantic kind of image, of a man, that populist kind of man that's overthrowing oppressors. In reality, he's incredibly brutal. He kills any dissenters, anybody who doesn't agree with him. He kills them, men, women, and children. Wipes out entire villages. I mean, the guy's a mass murderer. The people that are wearing his T-shirts in general just don't know that. They don't, for the most part. I hate to paint everybody with the same brush here, but for the most part, don't understand how absolutely brutal he was, and how many people he murdered. But Castro and Che are actually able to overthrow Batista. Initially, we don't know Castro's leanings. America kind of tries to court him for a little while, but then he announces that he is going to establish a communist government in Cuba, and he nationalizes all the businesses there, kicks out all the Americans, and establishes a communist government. So the government is going to own all of those resources. This is going to really upset America. These American businessmen have been kicked out now, and so they lost all their profits there, and so the U.S. will break relations with Cuba there, and that's going to last all the way up until the Obama administration. We're going to place sanctions on them. The Cubans, Castro starts to round up any dissidents within Cuba, so anybody who disagrees with him ends up in prison. He places controls over the economy. Now, initially, he redistributes land. He does all that stuff. And just like in previous lectures, when communists take over, the first few years economically are generally speaking pretty good for poor people, because they take from the rich and give to the poor. And so all these peasants get, some land, essentially free land that they get to work. But then, because of price controls and wage controls, you'll start to see a collapse within the Cuban economy. America is going to make it worse, because we're going to put restrictions on them, because they took away American businesses, and because they're communists, and that freaks us out. And so you'll start to see the economic collapse. And then, communist governments, when their economies start to collapse, because, they've de-incentivized work and risk taking, and, why work overtime if you don't get paid for it, kind of situation. That's a gross oversimplification, but it does essentially hold true. And so, the economies go down. Well, Castro, just like Mao in China, and Stalin and Khrushchev in the Soviet Union, will start to use political prisoners as slave labor, and so you'll start to see a mass exodus of Cubans that are going to leave Cuba, fleeing to Florida. Even today, you have a very strong Cuban population within Florida, and all of a sudden now America's freaked out. We're freaked out because, remember, we believe in domino theory. And now we have a communist nation 90 miles off of the coast of Florida. And so if one country falls, if you believe in domino theory, one country falls to communism, then its neighbors will too. And so all of a sudden now, America, because of domino theory, is very concerned about what's going on in Latin America. And so we're going to step up our presence there. We're going to start to, double down on our support for some real shady dictators that aren't communist in Central and Latin America. And we're going to keep a very close eye on Cuba. The Cuban issue, I mean, Eisenhower is coming up with plans to, assassinate Castro, and to invade Cuba and overthrow the communist government. But Eisenhower, even though they're coming up with those plans, Eisenhower's smart enough to know that that's not realistic. He actually makes a plan to invade Cuba, and his military generals do, and he shelves it, and he says, "Nah, that's not realistic. I'm a military guy. That won't work." And he shelves it. Well, when Eisenhower leaves office and Kennedy enters office, Kennedy, the military generals are going to present that same plan to Kennedy, and Kennedy's going to take him up on it, and that'll lead to the Bay of Pigs, which is a disaster. Kennedy just thinks, well, it was Eisenhower's plan. He's a military genius, and it'll make me look strong against communists. And so, it'll be a pretty big blunder. But Cuba will be an issue for the foreseeable future for the United States. And again, in large part because of domino theory. All right. The next major incident during the Eisenhower administration is going to be the U-2 incident. No, not the band. U-2 is a U-2 spy plane, and we have been spying on the Soviet military for a very long time. The U-2, again, American technology is, with the exception of the space race, pretty superior to Soviet technology. And so we have these U-2 spy planes that can fly so high that surface to air missiles can't, Soviet surface to air missiles can't reach them. And so we've been spying with relative impunity over the lesser populated areas of the Soviet Union for a while. And so these U-2 spy planes think that they fly so high, and they're taking pictures of Soviet military installations and whatnot. We think that they're safe. The problem is the Soviets know that we're doing it, even though we say we're not. And so the Soviets are trying to come up with a way to stop it, and they eventually invent a missile that can reach those U-2 spy planes. And so Francis Gary Powers, who is flying one of these planes, he's going to be the one that gets shot down, right? And so he doesn't suspect that there's missiles that can hit him from there, and lo and behold, there is one. Now, when he gets shot down, we don't want to admit to spying. We are illegally flying over Soviet territory, and so we really shouldn't be doing this. And the Soviets know we're doing it. We know we're doing it. But we believe, because it was shot down, and it was shut down at such a high altitude, that there's no way that Francis Gary Powers has survived. And we believe that the wreckage is going to be enough that we can probably deny that it ever happened. And so we are going to deny it. And, the Soviets actually play this pretty beautifully and make us look pretty bad. We think that we can deny this and get away with it. And so the Americans are just come out, and Eisenhower's like, nope, wasn't us. I don't know what happened, wasn't us. Now, the unfortunate thing is Eisenhower and Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, are getting ready to meet in Paris to actually talk about disarming and putting limits on nuclear weapons. And so both sides are starting to recognize that the arms race is getting out of control. But this happens right as we're supposed to meet. And so Eisenhower's like, well, crap, I can't admit to spying on the Soviet Union when I'm about to sit down with their leader to talk about disarming. And so, Eisenhower essentially just lies and thinks he can get away with it. Well, that's when the Soviets pull Francis Gary Powers, out, and essentially put him on trial. And they say, oh, you weren't spying on us. Well, then who's this guy? Right? The Soviets then, because we lied to them, say, well, we can't negotiate with you. And here's the problem. Khrushchev wants to negotiate with America about disarming. He sees that there's a problem with the amount of weapons that are growing. But the other communists in his Politburo, like the leaders of the communist government that are also very powerful, they're very hardline. And they're like, no, we're not going to, we don't want to negotiate. So Khrushchev really went out on a limb to sit down with Eisenhower and talk about disarming. And the second that he lied about Francis Gary Powers, the hardliners in the Soviet Union essentially forced Khrushchev to walk away. So we really miss an opportunity here to potentially disarm. And so, Francis Gary Powers gets tried. He gets a 10-year prison sentence, but he only ends up serving 2 years. We catch some Soviet spies here in the United States, and so we do a spy swap, and that will eventually get Francis Gary Powers freed. The point here is that we really kind of missed a good opportunity to de-escalate the Cold War, but we lost that opportunity because we were spying on the Soviets and then lied about it. We had to be spying on the Soviets. I'm not implying that the spying on the Soviets was wrong. It was something that if I were president, I'm sure I would have done too. But it is a thing that's going to be consequential later on. So Eisenhower will eventually leave office, and when he does, he leaves with some parting advice. I talked about this in the beginning of the lecture. He's essentially going to say, "Look, you know, we have given our military too much power, and there's risks involved with that. And we need to be really careful about how we move forward, because anytime you give, anytime you give the government a growing amount of power, there is the potential for negative consequences there. And I'm not advocating against giving the government power, right? I mean, we need the government to provide essential services and social safety nets. We got to have a strong military to defend our borders, and to do good around the world and to support democracies. There's no doubt about it. But you can't just open the floodgates, and that's what Eisenhower's saying, that can become dangerous. And so his quote here, and I'll read it to you: "In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist." And so, it's a Republican who's generally, favors a strong military, and the Supreme Allied Commander that says, "Look, giving too much power to the federal government for domestic reasons can endanger liberty," and the Republicans have been saying that for a long time. But the other side of that coin is true too, that the giving too much power to the military has the same risks, and so we got to find the balance there. All right, that concludes today's lecture on Eisenhower's foreign policy. I appreciate your time, and I will see you again soon.